ahead. Now, we've already had some history today, right? We've been to ancient Rome already. We've been to the Middle Ages just recently. We've kind of been all over the place. Here I'm going to take you a little bit more recent history, apparently recent history, the 19th century. And I'm going to talk to you about a guy named Benjamin Constant. Now, he's probably not on your top 10 list of people that you want to read, but he should be. And I'm going to tell you why today. So a little bit about Constant's life before we talk about his thought. He had a very tortured life. Let's just say he had a lot of women in his life, and it did not go well for the most part. He was born in Switzerland, as I have here. His mother died early, and so some scholars speculate that he sort of had mommy problems throughout his life, to put it in that way, and he sort of had lots of really failed relationships with women. He was raised by his father, but his father was mostly absent, so he had a number of tutors. And he kind of lived all over Europe, traveling from place to place with these different tutors. Eventually, he was sent to the University of Edinburgh. And some of those people that you might have heard about earlier, such as Adam Smith, that was where they were from. And so he was introduced to the Scottish Enlightenment while being at the University of Edinburgh. So he was introduced to those types of ideas about capitalism and free market economics early on in his youth. In 1794, he met Germaine de Stael, who was sort of most famous of his female liaisons throughout his life. They apparently had a daughter together, but it was never exactly admitted that she was his daughter. It was never completely clear whose kid she was, but apparently it was his. They moved to Paris. Now, it's important to remember what Constant is known for is for writing about the French Revolution. Now, we're going to get to that in a minute. But Constant was not actually French entirely, right? He was born in Switzerland. His family was a French Huguenot family. The Huguenots were Protestants who were kicked out of France. A couple centuries earlier, they moved to Switzerland to find religious freedom there, to be able to practice their faith. So he was from a French family, but he wasn't actually French, and Germaine still ought to remind him of this. Now, in 1794, what was going on in France? This is the time to go to France, Paris in the spring, Eiffel Tower, and all that. No, this was not the time to go, because this was the tail end of Robespierre's reign of terror. He was just chopping people's heads off. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This was not the time to go to Paris for fun. There was extensive political upheaval in Paris, and Constant jumps sort of right in the middle of that. Now, soon after Robespierre, Napoleon takes over, and he's eventually exiled by Napoleon, a dictator, so there's a lot of tumult going on in politics. He comes back to Paris in 1814 when Napoleon gets exiled, right? So they're switching places. Napoleon's out, Constant comes back in. Eventually, he exiles himself, Constant does, with the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. Then again, he returns back to Paris. So he has this life of leaving and going back to France. And he earned the parliamentary seat in 1819, and then he dies in 1830, right at the start of yet another upheaval in France. So what I want you guys to take away from this bit of biography is that he lived through a really tumultuous time in France. And this is the sort of thing that shaped his thought. He was sympathetic to the French Revolution, sympathetic to democracy. But his question was, why was it going so drastically wrong in France? Right? We had the first French Revolution, then it ends up in sort of reign of terror, and then it ends up in a dictatorship, and then it ends up in a monarchy, and then we're back to a republic, and then we're back to a monarchy. They had revolution after revolution for a century practically. Things are not going well in France. And so his question is, what's going wrong? Why are things not going well in France? And actually, Constant was not the only one to ask this question. There's actually a whole school of French thinkers, French liberal thinkers, who are asking the basic question, why is democracy going wrong in France? What do we do to fix this? We keep having revolution after revolution. We keep going back and forth from despotism to anarchy. It's a complete political disaster. And Constant is one of those key thinkers. He was supportive, as I write here, about the French Revolution, but he was concerned freedom, about how to maintain freedom in France. And he was concerned that all of the various governments that they had, democratic, monarchy, despotism, none of them had genuine freedom. And he asked the question, why is that? So he was looking to try to find a moderate way, a way to instill freedom and democracy, a way to allow individual liberty to thrive in France. So he comes up with this theory. Because if you know anything about the French Revolution, it's all about freedom, right? They were revolting for liberty. They didn't get liberty. They got something else. And so Constant is faced with the question of why didn't we get the liberty that we thought we were going to get? So he says, he's got a theory. He says, you know what? States now, they didn't look like states used to. There's some differences. I've mapped these out. He's got 5 differences. He says, in the ancient world, city-states were small. And by small, he means really small. He means like the size of Springfield. They're little. Like Athens was small. He was thinking of the early Roman Republic, a small city-state. He said the ancient world had small city-states. He says modern nations, on the other hand, are really large, spread over a large landmass. He's thinking here of France, of England, of Germany, even of the United States. Large countries. Okay, so point number 1, small versus large. That may not seem important, but believe me, we're getting there. Number 2, as you guys might have heard if you were here this morning, is that ancient city-states thrived on being bellicose. Well, what does bellicose mean? On being warlike. The model Athenian citizen was a warrior. That's what she wanted to be. The model Roman citizen was a warrior. Whereas he says in modern states, we value peace. We don't want to be fighting. We have a different idea of what the good life is. It isn't to win in battle. If you've read Homer's Iliad, if the model of the Greek life is to be a great warrior, Constant says that the model of the modern life is to be peaceful, to live at peace in your life, to not constantly be at war. We don't want that. We don't value the martial virtues in the same ways the ancient world did. The third thing he notices is he says, you know what, in the ancient world, they didn't value trade. They didn't value commerce. Now this seems a little bit odd, but let me tell you a little bit about both ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The people that engaged in trade were foreigners, were from the outside. Citizens were actually not allowed to be businessmen. That was seen as sort of a low profession that you couldn't be engaged in. The citizens in both Rome and Athens were farmers, were those types of people. That was an honorable thing to do, was to be a farmer. But to be a sort of commercial tradesperson, that was something that was sort of needed but on the margins of society. Whereas Constant notices, actually today though, we value business, right? If you think about the top professions, many people actually want to be business people. They want to engage in trade. They want to engage in commerce. This is a positive and valued contribution to society. So that's the third difference. The fourth thing that he noticed, and this was also came out in Jim's talk earlier today, was that ancient societies just assumed that there would be slaves. This was true in ancient Greece. The democracy in ancient Greece only worked because there was a slave class that did the work that allowed everyone else to basically take part in politics. And there was a similar dynamic going on in Rome, that you needed a slave class, and that was just sort of what society was grounded upon. Now, Constant notices that we're actually not happy with that solution today. We don't want to say, oh, well, there are just some people born to be slaves and some people born to be well off, and that's just how it's going to be. No, we prefer to think about people as being fundamentally equal in modern society. So he says, here's yet again another major difference between the ancient world and the modern world. Lastly, he says ancient city-states were motivated by virtue. Now by virtue, he means something very specific here. He means patriotic self-sacrifice. That you're willing to give up your life and yourself for the whole, for the city-state. You're willing to go into battle. You're willing to sacrifice your own needs and your own desires for the entire community. And he says, this isn't the case in the modern world. In the modern world, we're more motivated by our own self-interest. We prefer not to have to make too severe sacrifices for our country, or for anyone else for that matter. We prefer to be concerned more with our own self-interest. So what's going on here is that Constant wants to lead us in a direction of saying there are actually two different types of liberty that correspond to these two different types of societies, which he labels ancient societies, right? Small, bellicose, anti-trade societies with slavery and a high value on sacrifice, patriotic sacrifice. And there's a liberty that's suited to modern nations, which are large, they value peace, they're commercial, they value equality, and they're primarily motivated by self-interest. So we see where this is going. He's moving us in this direction. Here's a couple of quotes. He says, this is the type of liberty that's suited to the ancient world, to that society that I just described. He says, ancient liberty consisted in exercising collectively, but directly, several parts of the complete sovereignty. And then he explains what he means by that in the next quote. So, to sort of piggyback on Jim's talk this morning, ancient liberty was political liberty, and by political liberty, he means here direct democracy. You have the liberty to exercise a type of self-governing autonomy, where you participate directly in the government. And he says this is the type of thing that we see in ancient Athens. The type of liberty they valued was the liberty to take part in government, to participate in government, to deliberate in the public square, to make decisions on behalf of the city-state, and to be a part of their society. That, however, is different, as he says here, from the liberty of the moderns. So while the liberty of the ancients is the liberty to exercise collective self-government, right? Democratic self-government, direct democracy. He says the liberty of the moderns is a more individual one. So if you look here, I won't read the whole thing. He says modern liberty is the right to be subjected only to the laws. Here you see that liberalism that we heard about earlier, to be neither arrested, detained, put to death, or maltreated in any way by the arbitrary will of one or more individuals. So we encapsulate that under the sort of language of due process. And then if we go on here, it's the right of everyone to express their opinion, so that's freedom of speech. The right to choose a profession and practice it. Freedom of commerce, right? No one's going to tell you what profession you have to be. The right to dispose of the property and to even abuse it. The right to come and go, right? That you can move around it. These are the types of liberties that we value in modernity. The right is moved down here to profess whatever religion you want, to associate with people that you would like to, so the freedom of association. So the difference that he's drawing out here, that I want you guys to see, is that he's contrasting democracy, right, collective self-government, with individual freedom. And he says what we want in modernity is what we really want is those individual freedoms. We want the right to marry who we want. We want the right to choose our own jobs, move where we like, to make the money we want, dispose of property, to choose our own religion, to associate with people that we like to. Those are the values that we prize. But let me ask you a question. Elections are coming up soon. For how many of you is this the highlight of your year? This is the day you're looking forward. It's all on your calendars, right? You're thinking, this is the day. I get to be involved in government. I get to vote. Does that resonate with anyone?
Well, November 3rd, because then it's over.
There you go. It's coming up soon. I think it's the 4th. It's coming up soon. This is your chance to vote. What Constant is betting is that you are more concerned and you spent more time deciding to buy which smartphone you got than deciding on who to vote for. That's his wager. He says in modernity, you care more about your material well-being, about having nice things, about choosing a mate. Those voting, speaking in the public square, writing op-ed articles, being a public activist. That's the wager he's making here, and only you know if he's right on that. But that's the wager he's telling us, is that there are two different types of liberty. So why? What he wants to say is, of course, the people used to really value speaking in the public square, engaging in public debate, voting. That used to be what their whole lives were consumed with. And he said, but that only worked in a very particular type of society. So let me explain. He says that only works in a really small society. So imagine, he says, if you live in a small town and you get to help in the governance of that town, you actually feel like your ideas might matter. Whereas he says most of us live in big, modern countries, and we don't really feel our vote counts. Do you feel your vote counts? Do you go to that ballot box thinking, I am casting the deciding vote. This is me. I am making a political statement. He wagers that no, you probably don't feel that way because you're voting with so many other hundreds of millions of people. He says, but in an ancient society that was very small, this was an important thing to do. The next thing he says, to go back to peacefulness, he says, when we were all warriors, if you guys don't know about warring, let me tell you a few things. First of all, you can only do it during certain times of the year. Why do you think you can only do it certain times of the year? Go to war. Exactly. So he says, look, if your major job is being a warrior, you have plenty of time when weather's bad to sit around and talk, to debate public affairs, because you've got nothing else to do, right? Because remember, your slaves are doing the work for you. They're running the farm. Things are okay at home. You don't gotta mess with it. You can't go to war right now. So he says, of course you've got time to sit around and talk. Of course you've got time to care about voting and do your research on candidates. But he says, now we're in a peaceful society, and we get to trade all the time. You can buy stuff on Amazon any time of day or night, right? There is no bad season for shopping. In case you haven't noticed that. Shopping is a year-round enterprise. So that means we've sort of squeezed out that time in our life where we're going to sit there and look at voting records and think about what political issues are important to us, right? That's, we got other things to do, right? We've got Amazon reviews to read. We can go to the mall. We got other stuff we can do, right? Because commerce is a year-round type of business. I've already mentioned the slavery piece there, that of course it's really convenient if we've got slaves to take care of the household chores for us. Of course women, right, because they're not really leaders. We've got slaves and women. So they're doing the work for us. So we have time to debate, right? If you've seen Socrates, right, have you ever thought, if you've read a Socratic dialogue, he's not feeding himself, he's not doing any work. He's like just sitting around and talking with people. Well, I mean, that's a pretty privileged life. Some guy who just gets to sit around and talk and doesn't have to go to work. Lucky Socrates. Well, that's the Greek ideal, that you've got this space and this freedom to engage in this type of public dialogue. And Constance's betting that you don't have that time anymore, that you probably have to go to work in the morning, and you have to earn some money, and you have to wash the clothes, and you have to do the dishes, and that's what modern life is like. Lastly, he says, because of all of these changes, we're caring much more about the individual than about the community. We're caring more about our own well-being, and the well-being of the whole entire community is less important to us. Right? We're thinking more on an individual level as a result. So where this is going is what he thinks France has gone wrong, is that they tried in the French Revolution to give themselves that ancient liberty that we just talked about, direct democracy, without getting any modern liberty. So this is where France messed up, is they tried to give us this great ancient liberty, but you know what? We don't want ancient liberty anymore. We want freedom of religion, we want freedom of speech, we want freedom of press, we want freedom of assembly, freedom of commerce, we want those things. But we don't necessarily care that much. We don't think it's that effective to be given, oh, hey, you've got the right to vote, when it doesn't seem to do any good. It doesn't seem to change much. The stuff that really seems to matter is whether or not we're making a good living, whether or not we get to say and do the things that are important to us. So he says this is where France has gone wrong. And these are some of the institutions ancient and modern here, that actually France tried to instate. So these are the ancient ones over here. Ostracism, a brief bit about that. In ancient Athens, it was common that if you kind of got in trouble with the community, you could be exiled, sort of like a timeout. And you'd be sent away from the city for 10 years maybe, or forever possibly. And we actually still have the shards, where you would write down the name of the person basically to send on timeout. And so they actually tried to do this in France, where they would just like exile. Just be like, actually you're a problem, we don't really want you here anymore, we're gonna send you out. And what Constance says is, that maybe makes sense in a small community where they all govern together and everyone makes decisions together. But in a modern society, that seems like a bad idea. Why are we just randomly exiling people? He says that's an institution for the ancient world. That's not a modern institution. Okay. Number 2, censorship. France also tried to institute this. The ancient world had this. Strong censorship policies. He said, well, no. What we want in modernity is the right to think what we want, to speak how we want, to publish how we want. Right? Those are the types of freedoms that we value. So when France is trying to institute censorship in order to sort of keep everybody on the same page in the Republic, Constance saying that this is a bad idea. Yet again, this is not the type of freedom that we want in modernity. Third, religious establishments. All ancient polities had a really close relationship between church and state. This was true in Rome, this was true in Athens. To be a proper citizen was to worship the right gods. End of story. There was no worshiping the God that you believe is right. There was no discussion about this. This was just, if you're a good citizen, you offer worship to the gods, and that's how it works. Socrates got put to death for this. This was a problem. And it was not just because he was worshiping gods that they didn't think exist, but because he was being politically subversive, right? And so France is yet again trying to do this. France actually, interestingly enough, got rid of all of the holidays and tried to institute new ones. So imagine tomorrow if you woke up and the US said, no more Christmas, no more Easter, no more Halloween, we're going to celebrate completely different holidays on totally different days. And what's more, you guys all have to come out and have a big parade celebrating the US on these days. Well, needless to say, they were not popular. They did not work well, and they eventually went back to the old holidays. But this was part of their effort to sort of get everybody on the same page and sort of create a kind of old-style democracy. Lastly, all ancient societies, all ancient democracies had really strict educational routines. You had to be educated in a very particular way.